Okay, so I was wondering where the Bratrude name comes from.
The Bratrude name, first of all, is a Scandinavian name. My dad was Norwegian, and his mother and father immigrated to Minnesota.
When was that?
I haven't any idea. It was
Okay.
before I got here. And so I would guess that it was, oh, let's say 1910 to 20, sometime in there. And there were 3 boys in the family. And my father's name was Amos Presley Bratrude. And so that's what my name ended up. And since he used Amos, they called me Junior. And then somebody called me Sonny. So it was Sonny Amos Presley Bratrude Jr.
Wow.
And that seemed like an awful lot of name to me. So when my kids came, I have 4 children, and the names are Christy, Ted, Bruce, Paul. None of these complicated names. So anyway, they settled in Minnesota. Interestingly enough, my dad's parents chose not to speak any Norwegian in the house to make everybody learn and speak English better. And that's kind of too bad, because the language ability is, pretty much more important today.
Yeah.
So anyway, one of my father decided to go into medicine and became a family doctor, and a brother also went into medicine, and I believe he was a family doctor too. Both of them were practicing in Minnesota at one time. And I got something in my throat. My dad went to medical school in Chicago, I believe. And when he first started practice, he started in downtown Chicago. People didn't have much money, but there was a lot to do.
Yeah.
So then, after a couple of years, he was put an office in a suburb where there was more money so that people could pay. The Depression hit, and his downtown practice, in downtown Chicago, was busy, but anybody paid, and the competition for the moneyed ones was pretty high. So he ended up having the overhead of 2 offices, and so he picked up and went to Renville, Minnesota, town of, I'm sure, less than 2,000, about 100 miles west of Minneapolis.
Oh.
And the family home had 2 big bedrooms upstairs, and that was, he converted the living room into his office, and I remember he used to do tonsillectomies in the upstairs bedrooms. My mother was a nurse, and she'd help. After about 6 years, life in Renville, Minnesota was hard. It would go to 40 below in the winter, and it would go over 100 in the summer. And mosquitoes, you required transfusions on a regular basis because there were so many mosquitoes. Anyway, so he found out that the town of Antioch, Illinois, 50 miles north of Chicago, could probably support another doctor. And so the whole family in 1936 moved from Renville, Minnesota to Antioch, Illinois. Antioch was a mile from the Wisconsin border, and 50 miles south was Chicago. And my dad practiced then, and that seemed to go pretty well. And then the Second World War came in Pearl Harbor in 1941. And my dad had been in the First World War, but never, he was only in a few months and the war was over. And for whatever reason, having already been in, and he was 42 years old at the time he made this decision, he decided he needed to go back into the military and fight for his country.
Wow.
And so off he left, and he basically was gone for almost 40 months. So for about 4 years, I didn't see him much. So from 12 to 16, he wasn't much of a factor. When he came back from the war, he had gone into Germany about 40 days after the original invasion, and had been with the troops in in Germany, and it was a tough time. And my dad was a smoker, and his health wasn't as good as it should be. And so he finally got out and came home. He tried to go back into practice, but he didn't have the energy for that. So he went to work for the government, and his job was to evaluate medical disability, to decide who, needed help and didn't need help. And I, obviously went on with my life. And so, growing up in Antioch, Illinois, it was about 1,000 people. And so I've often said in February there would be 1,000 people, and in the 4th of July there would be 100,000 within 10 miles of town. We lived in Antioch, Illinois, was called the Land of Lakes. And so they had a lot of lakes and sloughs and stuff. And there was one group of 9 lakes that they put channels between, and that was called the Chain of Lakes. And on one side, the Fox River came out of Wisconsin, went through Grass Lake, which was a pretty good lake, probably 5 or 10 miles across in a slough area. And then, but you could get in a boat and go in this chain around, and I think it was like 20-some miles, and you could go through all those 9 lakes. And people in Chicago, of course, like many people, if life gets better, you want to have a second place to go to. And so there were literally thousands of cottages, and these were in fancy, mostly, middle class or lower. And so this mob of people would come in the summertime. And so when I was picking a place to practice, I looked at Chelan and decided it was a beautiful place and more upbeat than my little town had been. And so I picked Omak because I liked the weather, I liked hunting and fishing, and it was excellent. So that's how that went. That's quite a good answer, isn't it?
That's a great answer. What about your grandparents? Did you ever see them, or were they in Norway? Or?
My grandmother was widowed and lived alone for quite a while, and then my mother's brother was a dentist in Burlington, Wisconsin. That was just 20 miles from Antioch.
Oh, cool.
And there were several years there where Grandma came and lived with the son, Don Mower, and 6 months with our family, Grace Mower Bratrude. And then she became more care, and the dentist's wife didn't feel she could handle that, and so we ended up with Grandma full-time for probably her last 18 months. And I look back on it now, and we called it senile dementia. If you get old, and I don't know whether it's because she was maybe 89 when she finally passed away, so I don't know.
What was her name?
Maurer.
Maurer.
Yeah, Isabel Maurer was Grandma's name.
Okay.
And my mother's name was Grace Maurer, and then became Grace Bratrude.
Okay. And I was researching on the internet a little bit, and I saw in Norway Bratrude doesn't have an E at the end. So did they change that at Ellis Island or something?
That's an option.
Oh, okay.
There are some people in Tacoma that are Bratrude, and they don't use an E. And there are some that pronounce our name as Bratrude, because there was an E on it, Bratrude.
Yeah.
And I think that, a lot of immigrants to the country modified their name, and so Bratrude can come either with or without an E.
Since we have family from Norway, do you know if we have any Viking in us, or if we have any?
I'm
not really sure. Okay, just curious. Yeah. Could you tell me a little bit about Corrine? Because I was 1 when she passed. So.
Yeah. In the summertime, when I started caddying on a golf course when I was 10, I was a fairly good size at 10. And when I was 14 was during the war, that'd be 1944, and it was an 18-hole golf course, a public golf course, and it was nice, not fancy, and it was very hard to get help, and so they hired myself at 14 and Jimmy Fields at 15. We were 14 and 15 years old, and it was 6 days a week, some days as much as 10 hours a day, for the whopping sum of 45 or 50 cents an hour. 50 cents, that is, an hour. So I worked there for 3 summers, and then started my 4th summer, and we had a minor bump in our salary, and I said, I got to have more money. And they looked at me and he said, no, you don't. So I went out and got a job working with a carpenter, and enjoyed that much more than sitting on a tractor cutting grass. And I did that for that summer, and then I came back after my first year of college and went back to work for the carpenter. He was building these little cottage cabins, and stuff.
Where did you go to college?
My first year of college was Ripon College in Ripon, Wisconsin. That's in the middle of the state of... after I was going to be an engineer, and I actually had been accepted at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But as it got time to go, I got cold feet, and I literally decided on Ripon, where my mother had gone to school. In August, I called them, and I had quite good grades, and so they admitted me. There was less than 1,000 students in this college, and it was a good year. I played football in freshman, and I wasn't as big or nearly as fast as those kids that came out of Milwaukee and so forth. So I quickly decided football wasn't my career. And the engineering thing, I got my feeling about guys that wanted to be engineers is that they were a little nerdy. I mean, we used a slide rule in those days that would do not what your computers do, but mathematic things would work real well. And so at about Thanksgiving time, I decided I wanted to be a doctor. And my dad was a doctor, and I didn't think he had a good time, and I didn't think I wanted to be a doctor. But then I get away from home and decided that I do. And now it's Thanksgiving. We're on a semester system, so the grades come out at the end of January. And I had been, I playing football, chasing girls, and joined a fraternity. And if I was going to go to medical school, I was going to need pretty good grades. So I finally woke up and started, putting some effort into it. And by the time I finished my first year of college, I had decent grades. And I came home, and my dad said hi. I said hi. And we talked a little bit, and he said, so you think you want to be a doctor? I said, yes, I'm going to be a doctor. Well, he had a good friend, a doctor, who was on the admission thing for the University of Illinois Medical School. Now, he wouldn't pull strings, but he advised my dad that if I was going to try to get into medical school, that I should go do my undergraduate at the university at Champaign-Urbana in the middle of Illinois. So I told my dad impassionedly that Ripon was a very good school, and people do get accepted to medical school if they have good performance at Ripon. And he said, we'll talk about it in the morning, but you're going to go, if you're going to be a doctor, you're going to go down there. Well, then in the morning, he was already gone when I got up. And so about 2 days later, by myself, I went to Champaign-Urbana, which was about 130 miles south, and registered for to go to college there, and that I wanted to be a doctor. Now the advisor I had was looking at a young, somewhat immature, and a guy who had gone to a small school and had fairly good grades, but not earth-shaking. And he said, well, you ought to have another major in case that didn't work out. And I told him with assurance that it would work out. Then I told him that I've had 1 year of French and I really didn't like it. And if I got a Bachelor of Arts degree, I'd have to take that 2nd year of French. And I wasn't going to take that 2nd year. So I want to get into medical school after 3 years of college. And he said, well, you know, there's not a chance in the world you'll do that. And I was a little angry by now, and I said, look, you just write down what I need to have done, and then I'll take care of it from there. And by now, I'd gotten studying down to a pretty good science. I'm pretty efficient when I do things, and so I could focus, and I never could study with somebody else because there was too much distraction. And so in 2 years at the University of Illinois, I had all A's and 3 B's, and I got accepted at the end of, I got accepted in my 3rd year, so I did get there.
Awesome.
So my birthday's in August, so when I graduated from high school I was 17, turned 18 in August. So then I had 3 years of pre-med, and so now I'm 20 years old and I'm starting medical school. When I was a junior in my 3rd year of college, my mother was killed in an accident. My dad then was home, and he died within the year, so I lost both parents when they were 52 years old.
Wow.
Anyway, where was I?
How you met Corrine?
Oh, okay. And next to this golf course was a subdivision, you know, small lots that people would build their cabin on, and the lake in the channel was there, and and I'm working on the golf course, and there's another gal that lived near the golf course, and so the guy I worked with and I was probably 16 or so at the time, went out on a double date, and he had Corrine and I had Charlotte Gerber, and she didn't turn me on, but Corrine did. And so we had we obviously were attracted to each other. And so I ended up going off to college, and I was, committed to her at that point. I've often said I went with her for 3 years and she went with me for 1. But anyway, then she went to Augustana College, which is over along the Columbia River, on the Mississippi River. And I didn't have a car. And I could hitchhike and get to Augustana College, probably 160, 70 mile trip. And the bus, that's a an east going west to get to there, and the major traffic was Chicago south to St. Louis to New Orleans. So there wasn't really good bus routes, and you'd have to, and so I would put my leather jacket on from high school, those jackets that you got, and then I'd print Moline on one card and Peoria on the other one, and so I would put on my high school leather jacket and look spiffy, and I have a little sign that would say like Peoria, because I had to go through there to get there. And lots of times hitchhiking was far more common then than now. And if I'm driving and I don't know whether the guy got 3 miles to go or 5 miles to go, but if the sign says he wants to go to Peoria and that's 60, 80 miles, why not? Mm-hmm. And so I would walk to the edge of town and start hitchhiking, and that worked very well. I didn't go very often because she was busy being a freshman in college. And then so the next summer she came back, and by now I've lost my mother, and she had some kind of job and would come weekends, and we saw her, got to see each other. It was a little over 2 miles to that cabin that she lived at, that cottage, and I would ride a bicycle out to there and see her and come home. Anyway, then after my, then I went on to medical school, and before I went to medical school, I explained to her in some detail that I was very serious about this, and now she was going back for her second year, and she was maybe a little more, finally more interested in me. So then off I go to medical school, and she ended up going to a teacher's college in north of Chicago. I can't remember the name right now, and lived with her parents, who lived in an apartment in Chicago.
The Lindells, right?
Pardon?
The Lindells? Was that their last name?
Yes, Otto and Carrie Lindell. And they're Swedish. I didn't hold that against them because I'm Norwegian. Anyway, then, you know, at that point, we were planning at point sometime getting married, and it was a pretty busy time. I started medical school, you know, in September. My dad passed away probably in about October, and so we ended up getting married after my first year of medical school, and she still had a year of college to finish. So we rented an apartment, and this was in the turn of the century, 1910. This was a high rent district and big apartments and so forth, and it was now the Cook County Hospital, which is a huge place, and the University of Illinois Medical School, and this was almost a slum area now, and the rent was $15 a month, and Corinne's dad was a fix-it man, and we had just about a light hanging in the middle of a room, and there were still gas jets on the wall because they used gas for light, and so he put in electric stuff, and we did things that, you know, fill the rat holes and the cockroaches, and we thought we were having a good time.
That's great. So, and then you guys had 4 kids eventually.
Well, then she finished college, and so when I was in my when I was in my south year of medical school, she was in her last year of college. So the next year I would be a junior, and she started teaching, and now we were living high, boy, because we had money coming in, and still didn't own a car. And finally, you know, bought a used car, and that didn't work out, and so I bought an Oldsmobile. It was a little stripped down, but it was you know, I was really proud of that. And so now I'm starting, Christy was the first, you know, and she came when I was a senior in medical school, and in October, and then in June we were going to graduate from medical school, and you go to an internship, and so several of us went down to California to look at internships, rode the El Capitan, the railroad thing, not a lot of flying in those days, or it was quite expensive, and picked San Diego as a place to intern. And so then we moved to San Diego, and we had Ted the next spring.
In San Diego?
That would be the spring of, I'll be 56. I think so. Anyway, and then after, so I had taken Corinne away from her family, and now we're living in San Diego. Her mother is a little dingy, I thought, but anyway. So we decided that I didn't know what I wanted to do yet, and I had been deferred for the service because I was in medical school, and at some point after I got out of medical school, I had to give them 2 years of my time. And so I signed up with the Navy because I thought if I was going to go to war, I'd rather be on a ship than in the mud. And so the 1st of July, then I started, the idea was that she was going to go, and her mother could get some time. She was going to go to the cabin on, near Antioch, and Madison, Wisconsin was 90 miles away, so I could, and I was on duty every other weekend, but so about every 10 days I'd get 3 or 4 days and I'd come home. After she'd spent a month with her mother, she was going crazy, and so I called up the Navy and I said, call me up. And they said, okay. And then I got the letter and I showed it to the hospital. I didn't tell them I requested to go. I said, I'm sorry, I got to leave I was in the surgical residency, and it was just a couple of months. So then we went into the Navy, and my first duty station was in Dallas, Texas, in an Armed Forces Examining Center, and it was not what I planned. And so I found out about aviation medicine to be a flight surgeon, and so I hadn't been in the Navy or in duty for a week, and I filled out all the paperwork to apply for aviation medicine, and that came through, and so I was in Dallas for about 9 months. Then we moved to Pensacola, Florida, and I was there 6 months, and that was a wonderful time. There were 32 guys in my aviation medicine class, and half of them were single, and they wanted fighter squadrons that would be carrier-based and stuff. And I had some previous interest in the Pacific Northwest, so the opportunity came to go to Whidbey Island and Oak Harbor. And so I came to there in probably I was probably 1957 in January. I think that's about right. And that I had a very good time there. And from there, we started spending some weekends looking at potential places to live. And OMAC came. And so here I am.
That's great.
Sitting on my balcony overlooking the town of OMAC.
Yeah. It's really great.
Why don't we stop for a minute and let me see whether...
Yeah.